What is up, guys? How's it been going? I haven't really been recording too regularly, but the reasoning behind that is because I've just been consumed doing other things and not focusing too much on recording on here. But let's talk about Jesus this morning. So we've passed a lot of the high holidays. I guess that's what's considered the high holidays. I don't really know. But Rosh Hashanah and Sukkot and Yom Kippur, not in that order necessarily. Kind of mixed up the order. Sukkot comes last, and I guess Simchat Torah is at the end. The beginning of a new Torah cycle, the beginning of a new Jewish year, even though it's already a couple days in. And, I started out with the question during these holidays of like, where is it mentioned in the New Testament of Jesus, talking about Rosh Hashanah? Because I was like, I don't remember there being a story, but maybe there was some mention, and I didn't find any mention. And then, I kind of went, I guess, in the book of John. Now, I don't know if other Gospels mention Jesus at the festival of Sukkot, but I mean, it's an 8-day festival, and so I'm going to talk about this by memory. You can read it in the book of John, the Gospel of John, but I'm going by my memory. So I would recommend, if you're going to listen to this, go ahead and read about Jesus and Sukkot. Just read the whole section about it, and then listen to the rest of this, because I'm going by my memory. So if I say anything wrong, apologies, but I don't want to be reading, I feel like if I pull out a Bible and start talking, then I'm going to be reading it. It's hard for me to paraphrase or talk about concepts without just reading it. And next thing you know, we'll be 3 chapters deep, just reading word for word, when you can read it word for word yourself. I don't want to waste that time, when you can just pause and read it yourself. Figure out for yourself what you think it means. What I kind of like to do sometimes, I was talking to a friend about this, I like to read something, see what it was that I was taught, and see if when I'm reading it, if that's what I understand. Now, growing up in an Adventist denomination, I talked about this, and I'm not going to go too detailed about it, but at the moment, but I always found it confusing that Adventists are very, interested in keeping the Sabbath, but when it comes to other, Jewish holidays, holy days, Adventists don't traditionally keep them, and it's more common that you'll see Adventists avoiding, I'd say on the mainstream holiday end, the biggest difference you'll probably see is Adventists avoiding Halloween and avoiding holidays that tend to be religious falling on a Sunday. I personally, and maybe this is different now, but I personally have never gone to something that would be considered a church service on a Sunday, even if it was Easter Sunday. And Adventists do usually keep Easter, Christmas, New Year's Eve, Thanksgiving, all these other holidays. um, and the Sabbath weekly. So it is a little bit confusing, having been connected to a religion that says they follow all this stuff and then it's like they kind of don't. But I think every religion is probably that way. Um, there are probably people in the religion that follow everything that they say, and then there are probably other people that just they like to get on other people's case, and that's kind of more what I've seen is, or what sticks is, the people who are kind of ridiculing and judgmental and hurtful and not really using a lot of compassion or understanding and pointing out that other people aren't living a strict life, but then, they've got their own personal issues that they deal with, and they just expect that, you know, nobody challenges them on that. But they're more than willing to get in someone's face and challenge them. But I'm not really trying to talk about all that. It's just if you know, you know. If you've been around, church life, religious life, I don't think it's just Christianity. I think a lot of religions kind of breed this. You can go too far in another direction sometimes. That's not compassionate. But let's talk about these holidays, because I haven't really talked about a lot of them lately. I talked a little bit, and then I just kind of left it alone. This year has been different for me with my approach to some stuff. I really just, I haven't been waking up every morning to record. I mean, I'm up, but I don't always record. I just haven't had that energy, but on occasion I'm studying stuff, so I just haven't really been studying in a lot of linear order in a way that I can really talk about something. But when I went into the book of John, I first went through, and, I have a New Revised Standard Version Bible that, I have other versions, but that's my main one that I like. The only thing I don't like about this specific Bible is that it doesn't have the footnotes where you can kind of look up the verses where if someone says it's written in the law, or remember it is said in the scriptures or something like that, and like all the references in the New Testament to like what something in the Old Testament says, it doesn't have those footnotes. And so I really like the footnotes to go back and compare the quotes, but I don't have the footnotes in this Bible. But I've kind of had this Bible for so long that I just kind of enjoy it. So, with the story with Jesus and Sukkot, let me see. I guess what I want to talk about is kind of touching on this topic, how in Jewish tradition it's taught that Jesus doesn't follow the laws or the commandments, therefore he cannot be the Messiah. Jews don't believe in the divinity of Jesus. They don't believe in Jesus as God. There's a very interesting video on YouTube where a guy is going around, I think in Israel, I don't know where he is, but he's asking Jewish people, religious Jewish people, what would they rather do? Would they rather, if they had to pray in a Muslim mosque or pray in a Christian church, if they had to pick between the two, which one would they choose? And most people said they would not go to the Christian church because of the idolatry, because a lot of types of Christian churches, not all of them, have idols, have sculptures, have icons that are pictures. People do bow to them, they do kiss them, they do incorporate saints and Mary and others in their prayers, praying to these others. I always found that to be interesting. I'm not 100% sure where that came from or where it started, but it's not every church does that, and I could see why someone who's not Christian would look at that and be like, these people are worshiping saints, they're worshiping the mother of Jesus. Jesus never says to pray to saints. His prayer is the Lord's prayer. It doesn't even mention praying to the Son. It says at the end, "For thine is the kingdom and the glory forever. Amen." And at the beginning it says, "Our Father, which art in heaven." But there's no other mention in there of praying to Mary or the saints or any other thing. So I've always kind of wondered about that part, about the praying to other things part, other people. Because even Jesus in his own prayer wasn't praying to himself. You don't really see disciples worshiping him. He never taught his disciples, bow down and worship me. We'll get into this another time maybe, but I mean, there are those verses, I guess, around communion, and there are those phrases and comments that he makes where the Pharisees say that, you're saying you're the Son, and you're making yourself God's Son, and then you're making yourself equal to God. But Jesus doesn't necessarily say, yes, I am. He kind of just says, aren't we called sons? Aren't we all called sons? Or something like that. Like, it's kind of confusing how that gets interpreted to be Jesus is the Son of God. There is John 3:16 that most people know about, "For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish but have eternal life." That is in John. And then there's another verse. I know it from some kind of tune of a song. I can't remember exactly what the verse is. But when I was a kid, we did this play at the Christian school where it was like a Bible verses play. So we learned a lot of Bible verses, and some of them stuck just because it was singing, some of the songs. But there's that verse that says, "This is love, not that we love God, but that he loved us and sent his Son as an atoning sacrifice for our sins." So there are verses in the Bible that say that. I don't know if that comes from the Gospels or if that comes from Paul. I kind of like to separate those out because I guess at least with the Gospels, technically the people who wrote the Gospels were alive and around Jesus. Paul was not around Jesus um, in person when he was living, and some of his ideas, in my personal opinion, some of Paul's ideas seem contradictory to the Gospels or to what Jesus taught. Um, Paul went pretty far away from, you know, what Jews were doing, and he's like the main source of information, saying that he has all this information that he got given. There's some stuff that I guess I don't even know how you would be able to prove if Paul was even a student of Gamaliel or whoever that uh, big name rabbi was, a very respected rabbi in Judaism. I think a Pharisee. Paul says he was a Pharisee. From what I've learned, Pharisee is kind of what would be today's Orthodox Jews. That's from what I've learned, from what rabbis and Jewish historians say. So there was, and we know that not every Jewish person who practices Judaism is an Orthodox Jew. And so it seems like there were Orthodox Jews and there were non-Orthodox Jews, even like there are today. And so there is still that internal battle within the Judaism with these early Christians. There's that kind of battle. So as I'm stumbling through my words early in the morning, let me have some tea and see if it perks me up a little bit. But I had some questions. So I was looking at the story of Jesus with Sukkot, and it says, his brothers were gonna, I was looking at the holiday timeline. Now I think it doesn't show the holidays before Sukkot, but it has Passover. Before, I think it was before that. And then it talks about Sukkot eventually. So you see the story of Jesus' brothers saying, come with us to the festival, kind of like, shouldn't people be expecting you there? And he says, I'm not going to go. And then he secretly goes. And he's, I guess, found teaching in the temple, I believe. Or maybe the first place he goes, I don't know if he first is teaching in the temple, but then he goes, which order this goes in. Maybe he's teaching in the temple, goes and heals the guy with the mat, and then he's back teaching in the temple. But I remember it mentioning it was Sabbath, and he's walking around at that pool where there's this it's already confusing, right? This to me is already a confusing story because it says, that the water gets stirred, and when the water gets stirred, I guess the person or the people who get in there first get healed. And this guy had been there for some amount of years that was like a lot. I want to say decades. He had been there, unable to, he says, when the water gets stirred, there's no one to help me get over there. And you'd think after so many years, someone would figure out a strategy. I mean, it's easy for me to say, as someone who doesn't have an issue where I can't walk, I'm not stuck begging on a mat somewhere you know, rely on people's charity, um, and having an issue where I'm relying on other people to take me to go get healed. Um, but in my thinking, it's hard to figure out how someone could be that close to a place where healing is going on. I don't know how regularly that healing would happen, but it seems like it was going on a pretty regular basis. So healing is happening, but it's being, uh, this guy never got healed that whole time. It's just hard for me to wrap my head around this, because, like, it's easy to read through these stories and just be like, oh, like, okay, like, but when I think about it in, like, the modern day, like, I've, worked in the field of psychology. I don't think I've ever looked at a patient and been like, you were diagnosed early on in life, started getting prescribed medications, you know, um, maybe, for example, if they never took the medication, which is their choice, you know. I'm not even saying, I mean, I respect people's choices if they want to take, Western prescribed medicines. I respect people's choices if they don't want to take them, you know. But I feel like, I guess what I'm trying to say is making no change for some things that might be able to be helped with lifestyle change, diet change, exercise change, making no change, including not taking medications. I don't see how someone could really expect different results. Um, and I'm not trying to say that, like, people with mental health issues, I'm not trying to, like, take a stab at them or anything. I'm not, I've got my own issues, guys. I'm not like completely without problems, I've got physical issues, some mental stuff that goes on occasion. I'm not, within a category of people that should never consider medications or should never go to doctors, or like, my health is perfect. That's not true at all. But, you know, um, there's definitely stuff in my own life that I would need healed that, you know, uh, isn't things that aren't going right. Um, but just looking at this guy in general, it's always just been like an interesting story, because it's like, to have someone who's there for that long, um, someone who's there for that long is basically, uh, um, I don't know, like, because I only know from like a mental health perspective. The physical health perspective, I don't really know as much, but from a mental health perspective, I know that there's kind of a cycle to things. Everything kind of feeds something else. So if you've got an issue that makes it hard for you to get up on time or eat properly or have strong emotional connections and have a good social life and have friends and family that you're on good terms with and everybody gets along. Not all the time, of course, there's going to be disagreements, but you know, um, you can have a lifestyle or like an environment and surroundings where you're not necessarily going to be able to heal as well if you stick around it. It's not good for your health. And I've seen that a lot in the mental health field. It's like if you take homelessness, for example, um, if you think about it, it's like, okay, if somebody's struggling financially, can't pay for basic needs. I mean, imagine, you're a homeless woman, you know, if you have a menstrual cycle, even a normal menstrual cycle, like that doesn't have a lot of complications to it or anything, you're still going to need to pay for products to kind of deal with that. It's just nature. You can't, unless you have a way of not having that happen, you're going to have to deal with that. You're going to have to deal with hygiene in other ways. You know, there's stuff you're going to need to have to pay for. Like some stuff you just can't not have. Um, and there are places, where you can get supplies and things for free. Like a lot of major cities do have like food banks and places where you can get food, hygienic stuff. But the food, let's be real, it's not always like organic, healthy, fresh food. And if it is, you need a fridge or a cooler to keep it in. And if it is, it's usually near the expiration date, so it's not going to last as long. So you have to have somewhere to keep it. Um, Canned foods, boxed foods, eating that kind of stuff on such a regular basis. For someone who's already struggling, that's probably not going to make you feel absolutely wonderful every day, to be eating canned goods. It'll keep you alive, but it's not fresh and it's not maybe the healthiest way to go. Depending on the canned stuff and things like that too, though, like sometimes fresh food can be unhealthy too. Like fast food is fresh food and it's not necessarily healthy um, a lot of the time. So, even someone who does have a little bit of money, they might be able to afford some fast food, get some food bank food that's not healthy. The majority of food isn't going to be healthy. You're surrounded, if you're living in a shelter, you're surrounded with people that have issues with functioning and whatever problems they bring. I've lived with housemates, as we all know, that had issues enough to the point where I eventually was like, it was affecting my health physically and mentally, and I was like, screw this, I gotta go. Like I can't be letting this affect me as much as it is. So I chose to leave, but it was a hard choice for me to leave because I was getting a lot out of it. The rent was cheap. I knew the people after a while, and they weren't messing directly with me. They didn't like each other all that much, but nobody was on my case. So even to like try and move, I would have probably been paying $300 to $500 more a month just to move and live with someone else that may have been just one other person, but I don't know if that other one person would have been um, someone I wanted to live with. Um, and I had offers to live with people that were friends, like not to move in, and have them pay rent, but for me to split rent with them, it just wasn't happening. Uh, I wasn't comfortable with it because I was like, well, I don't maybe want, I like my privacy, basically. I don't really want to live with my friends, even though I would love to live with my friends. I don't really want to live with my friends. Like, I think about things like, okay, if I'm living with a friend and we have a friend group, and then they want to have company over, there's friends that maybe I don't want to see at that day, or maybe say if you have a date or something, and then other people are kind of like learning about it and stuff like that. Like I just don't want people involved in my life like on that level. I'd rather live with strangers. Um, but then that's a risk. Like who knows? They might be worse than the other ones. Um, but just with my own experiences with working with homeless people, dealing with roommates that have issues that are, I'm not saying I don't have issues, but I don't have issues that are interfering with people to the point where they need to like argue with me and stuff. Um, and it just, you know, it's disruptive. Like someone who's never been unhoused or had to rely on others, for charity or for people to give them money or to give them help so they can get healed. I mean, it is easy to blame a victim and be like, well, what aren't you doing? You know, but like I mentioned, it's a slippery slope. Like everything feeds other things. Like if you already don't have any money, you're gonna be super stressed. You know, um, you're probably not sleeping well. You might start relying on some kind of substances to help you, whether it's something that is gonna actually help you with the issue or something that's gonna zone you out to the point that you're like high or something or drunk or something to a point where you don't think about it. I'm not saying all homeless people take drugs. That's not what I'm saying. I'm not even saying that the majority of them do. I'm just saying, like, usually humans don't want to sit with their issues too much and problem solve um, because it's painful and it might be a little bit too much, or people just literally might be working and not making enough money, or not even able to work, and then the system for disability and all that kind of stuff isn't that smooth either. It's not enough money to really live off of. So I could see that, even if I try to put it in the modern day, in a modern day scenario, someone who's got some kind of problem where they've had the issue for decades, even if they're around sources where they can be healed, it's still not that easy to just get healed. And then there's the judgment too, because people judge. People judge. People look at homeless people when they're sitting on the side of the street or at a bus stop or whatever, and they think whatever they're gonna think. A lot of people are compassionate, but a lot of people don't want to be bothered. They don't want to give their money to somebody. Um, I get that way. I don't. If I'm kind of like tight on money, the last thing I want to do is give away a $10 or $20 bill to some guy that I see on a regular basis. Like a lot of the homeless people, and it's sad to say, homeless people in my community, literally say it that way. A lot of the homeless people in my community, it's like, that kind of hits in a way that I don't really like. Because I know there are people in my community. I choose to kind of turn away a little bit. Um, there's a place where I podcast where somebody literally sits probably within 10 feet of my car when I'm sitting in the car podcasting. I usually go park by him. He's not like coming up to my car or anything, but usually I park over by him. He's there for like hours. Um, and I'll just sit there and record. And sometimes I've thought to just open the window a little bit and record within earshot, you know, about some topics that are positive, just in case it helps. I don't want to directly be, I don't think I want to spend the energy making a lot of friendships in the community with people who I already know kind of have some unstable situation going on. But there is a part of my nature that is very pulled towards that, and um, there's a part of me that's avoiding doing it. A part of me that's like, just don't do it. Just you don't have energy for that. But in a way, it actually does give me energy. Almost like when people say, okay, I don't have energy to work out. But then you go work out and you're like, I feel more refreshed. I feel less tense. I feel a little more energetic, a little endorphins, and it can make you feel better. Like there are certain types of ways to use your energy that can like increase your energy. in a lot of ways, to a certain extent. I mean, if you work out to a certain point, you're going to be exhausted. But if you're working out within like a limit, it actually can give you more energy at a certain point than laying around all day, you know. And that's kind of how I feel about helping people. It can give more energy, but I'm kind of scared to go down that route because I get so tired so much of the time that I'm like, dude, I don't know if I can just be like trying to get involved with new people like that. Um, so this is taking place on the Sabbath with Jesus. You know, he comes across this guy who has had this issue for so long. He ends up healing the guy. He tells this man, take up your mat and walk. Now, the Pharisees, I believe, or the religious leaders, they see this guy walking. They're mad, saying, Jesus healed you. Like like I guess how'd you get this way or something? And like he, doesn't know who healed him. Now I don't know exactly. Like, are these people just like patrolling and they just like see everything that's happening around? Like, I don't really know, but basically, Jesus is found in the temple where they confront him and they're like, you shouldn't be healing on the Sabbath. You shouldn't be, this guy is breaking the Sabbath from walking and carrying his mat. And, being raised Adventist, I'm like, okay, we know the commandments. We know the 10 Commandments. We know a lot of the other commandments that have to do with Sabbath or the word Sabbath, or where the Bible says, keep these as my Sabbaths. This is a Sabbath to me about some certain times of the year where it says that in the Bible too. Some of those holy days it says not to work or not to do like laborious work. But the most extreme I'd seen in Adventism or heard was people who weren't allowed to shower on the Sabbath. I mean, you could shower before and after. It's only really like a 24-hour period where you're not doing things. So it's from Friday sundown to Saturday sundown. You're not, for the strictest, they're not buying gas even to get to church probably. They're not working at their jobs. They're not studying for school. They're not buying things. They're not getting groceries. They're not running errands where you would have to buy stuff. They're not cooking meals. They have to prepare all that stuff before. You have to get prepared before Friday sundown so that everything is ready for Friday sundown to Saturday sundown and you're not working. But a lot of people go to church and they spend a lot of time in church, and you're spending at least an hour to 3 hours at church on one day. You might do like a Friday night thing, church related thing. You might do the church service. Some churches have a service in the evening as well. So you might go to church about 3 times within that 24-hour period, or at least once for people who do that. But that's considered strict within Christianity. Now this is a whole other level of strict. I would say in Adventism, people make the exception for doctors and nurses to work. I have heard of people, I don't know of anyone specifically who told me that they do this, but I've heard of people saying that some of the stricter Adventists that do work don't take a paycheck, or they give their whole paycheck for the Sabbath that they worked to the church, or they give more of an offering from that paycheck to the church for tithing or offerings and that kind of stuff. People can do what they want with that. No, no one. I don't think anybody's like telling someone they have to do it. It's not like in some religions where people are like forced. I heard that with Mormons, it can get, depending, it can get pretty strict, where they're almost forced to like tithe, and there's a lot more pressure on that. Um, it's more of a private thing in Adventist churches, but you kind of are expected to do it. Just I don't know if anybody really is gonna like tell you specifically about what to do with it, with your money. Like they're gonna talk about it, but I don't know if anyone's gonna confront you and call you up and be like, "Look, you haven't been tithing." I don't. I've never heard anybody say that. Um, but yeah, even I would say with the Sabbath stuff, of all of the Christian denominations, as far as I know, other than Messianic Jews, I would say Adventists are the strictest. Messianic Jews might have more of a Jewish tradition. They might follow more Jewish traditions than Adventists would. But I'd say Adventists take it more. They definitely do. I mean, Seventh day Adventists, Seventh day Sabbath, they don't believe in the first day Sabbath. They don't believe in Sunday Sabbath. They believe in the seventh day. I mean, it says it in the fourth commandment. Remember, is it remember the seventh day or remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy? Well, it says, remember the Sabbath day, keep it holy. 6 days shall you labor and do all your work, but on the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. So it's the seventh day, which is Saturday is technically the seventh day, but if you go by how people say it was evening, yeah, I mean in Genesis at the beginning with creation it says, and there was evening and there was morning, and that was the first day. So it starts with evening and then morning. So it starts with the sun is, it's night, and then this you go through the night, and then the sun comes up in the next morning. And the holidays are like that too. They usually start at sundown because that is the next day. So technically, if today I'm recording, it's Wednesday before Halloween. It's Wednesday today, but technically, for the Gregorian calendar folks, Thursday starts at midnight. For the lunar folks, Thursday starts Wednesday sundown. So sundown times right now are about 6:04 p.m. It's probably like 6:03, 6:02. Let me check. I like to stay kind of aware. So 6:02 is tonight sundown. Sun up. What am I saying? Sunrise is around 7:10 a.m. or so. I missed the time because it's 7:46 right now. 7:12. Tomorrow's sunrise is going to be at 7:12. So the sun's coming up later and later and later, and going down earlier and earlier and earlier. We haven't had the time change yet or anything. But that is all of what determines the Sabbath. And I feel like I need to kind of say that because if I'm talking to people who are Christians that come from Sunday Christianity, a lot of times people don't even like talk about the Sabbath the same way that other populations that keep closer to a Jewish Sabbath would keep it. There's like two types of Sabbaths. Like a lot of people, I've seen calendars where they start the week on Monday just to make it so that Sunday is the seventh day. I've seen those calendars as well. And so I'm not gonna, whatever. People, you do what you gotta do. But some questions I had, where in Jewish tradition? Now I use Chat GPT for this, guys. I'm not the hugest fan of Chat GPT, but I asked, where in Jewish tradition does it say a person cannot pick up a mat and walk on the Sabbath? Because in that fourth commandment, it does not say that anything about a mat. It says all the things that who cannot work, which is everybody, even your animals. So neither your manservant or your maidservant or the alien that is within your gates, or your ox, you're not allowed to use anything. Now, I think it's kind of interesting, if you hear about, I've heard Orthodox people say this, Orthodox Jewish people say this, and I don't know any people who use it, but if you say, if you say, what was I trying to say here? Okay, so there's something called like a Sabbath goy, where it's like if a Jewish person needs something done, like say for example, turn on a light switch. You're not allowed to really turn off and on a light switch. I don't know if you're allowed to turn it off, but I know you're not allowed to turn it on, because that's considered kindling a fire, right? So in modern day, a lot of the strictest of people wouldn't turn on a light switch, right? There you can debate about even just that sentence alone for ages. But if they needed a light switch turned on, they could see their non-Jewish neighbor, which they call a Sabbath goy. They could see someone who's non-Jewish and kind of hint at, you can't directly say, can you please turn on my light? You can kind of hint at, I don't know what you would say. My hands are really full with this baby, and it's really dark in this living room, and it would really be helpful if, the lights were on, and if that neighbor just catches on, oh, you need me to turn on the light for you, I'll do it because your hands are full, and just flip the light switch on for them. Now I wonder if that even follows the commandment in Exodus, the fourth commandment, where it says you're not allowed to let anybody work. Your servant, your ox, the visitor, alien, anyone within your household is not allowed to work. So I would wonder if, wouldn't that person, that neighbor who comes into your house, wouldn't that be considered the alien within your gates? And then you're allowing them to work? Or that's how I see it. But I don't know. I mean, people can argue that. But to me, that concept of like a Sabbath goy kind of seems like you're, like once you have this alien within your gates, this person who's within your gates, I don't know if it means someone who's a traveler or not a Jew or, a visitor, or, if you own a lot of property and there's people living on your property and you're, having them break commandments. Now it doesn't say necessarily in the Bible, don't turn on a light switch, don't light a fire. These are oral traditions. So, and I don't know what I think about oral traditions. I was not raised around, okay, that's wrong. I was raised around oral traditions, not necessarily Jewish oral traditions, but I think in Christianity, a lot of times people are raised around oral traditions because a lot of times Christians are taught, you know, even though there is stuff in the Bible, you're taught we don't do that, you know. We don't do that because Jesus did away with it or whatever. We don't do that because Paul said this or that, even though it says it in the Bible. And so that I would consider oral tradition. You're taught by the church what to do, even though the scripture, when you read it, says some other thing. There is that oral tradition that is kind of, in Christianity, the oral tradition isn't necessarily expanding on the commandments, making it stricter. Usually it's saying that you don't have to do it and some justification to like why you don't have to follow any of this other stuff anymore. Either if it's because of Jesus or Paul said it or it's under the law is too rigid or Jesus didn't do that or whatever. That's oral tradition, I would say. You're taught that. But let's remember, pretty much most of the people that Jesus was talking to, most of them were Jewish. Most of the time he was talking to Jewish people. He was Jewish and he was talking to Jewish people. This whole Christian concept wasn't really a thing so much. And even when it was in the Bible, people were still kind of Jews. They were Jewish. So ChatGPT says, in Jewish tradition, the prohibition against carrying items, including a mat, on the Sabbath comes from interpretations of biblical texts and the laws of Shabbat. The main source is found in the Torah, specifically in Exodus 20, verses 8 through 10, which commands rest on the Sabbath and prohibits work. The Mishnah, particularly in tractate Shabbat, elaborates on what constitutes work, or the word in Hebrew, melacha. Melacha. I don't know if I'm saying that right. And includes carrying items in public spaces as one of the 39 categories of work prohibited on the Sabbath. Now, this is from tractate Shabbat in the Mishnah, right? That's not in Exodus in the Torah. This is in the Mishnah that says you cannot carry items in a public space. Now, I've heard about the law about Sabbath of walking a certain distance or not being able to drive or walking a certain distance. I've heard that strict religious Jews live closer to the synagogue so they can walk on the Sabbath. I have heard somebody say, and I don't know where this comes from, so I don't know where I would find it if it exists, but I heard from a Christian perspective, somebody said that sometimes some Jews can't walk a certain distance on the Sabbath. Now, I don't know if it's a distance thing or that driving is considered work. Because I've seen people walking. I've seen religious Jewish people walking to and from a synagogue, and walking past my house, but there's not a synagogue that's like really close to me. The closest to me, well, is an ultra-Orthodox. There's a Chabad in Lomita. That's the closest to me. And it's like a 15-minute drive. There's a temple in Manhattan Beach. It's also about a 15-minute drive. So, you could technically walk those distances, but those are the two near me. Now, there's probably smaller synagogues around that I don't really know about, but those are the ones that I know. And I remember when in college I went to the synagogue once, and I was able to. I called first, like a couple days before, and I was like, "Can I come visit?" And they said yes. And they asked me my first and last name, and then they heard my last name, and they're like, "Okay, you're not Jewish." And I'm like, "No, I'm not Jewish." And then they told me, they asked me where I lived, and I told them, and they're like, "Oh, it's not like a walkable distance. Like you can't walk from there." Like, so over the phone, even I'm having this conversation about your last name isn't Jewish, you're not Jewish, and you can't, it's too far to keep the commandment of not driving, you know, um, you can't walk here, but they let me know that, like, we didn't have like some intense conversation, but I knew what they were getting at because I know about the walking thing. And so the tradition with the walking over driving. And so I know about that. And so I was aware of what they were saying, and I didn't like ask more questions or anything. I would have loved to sit and talk to, I would have loved it, but I was like, let me just keep this professional. It's for a school assignment. And I went with a friend, and there was a bar mitzvah going on that day. And I felt a little intrusive because I was like, well, we weren't invited to this bar mitzvah. And like, but then when I started watching Central Synagogue on YouTube, I realized that it's common for there to be a bar mitzvah or a bat mitzvah, and it's just part of the service. And if there just happens to be one that day, that's just what it is. People can invite their own guests, but we just, we went. We were invited to stay and eat, and we did that, and talked to the rabbi a little bit after, and it was a good experience. I enjoyed myself. It was something I'd always wanted to do. I really enjoyed myself, but a little bit of people talked to us, like a little bit, and it was my friend that afterwards was like, do you want to let's go talk to the rabbi. And I was like, okay, let's talk to the rabbi. And I needed a program for school. They had the Shabbat Shacharit service kind of transliterated on this like orange or yellow pamphlet, and I took that and stapled it to my paper that I wrote for school. Now, I don't think I was supposed to take it. I didn't ask to keep it because I kind of maybe knew that they were going to say this stays here, but I wanted it. And so I guess maybe it's considered theft, but I took it because I was like, I'm going to use this and learn it, which I did do at a certain point, but I don't know it right now. But that was an interesting experience for me. I enjoyed myself. I wished that it was more sociable, but I was kind of shy, and I didn't really know much about that kind of stuff. Like talking to people, and I was younger then too. Like if it were now, I would be just like talking to everybody, but just to chat, about stuff. And I thought it was fun, yeah. So it says, this is rooted in the principle that the Sabbath is a day of rest and caring is considered a form of labor. Now, I don't know. I mean, I would say rugs are heavy, but mats imply something lighter weight, portable. At least that's how I see it when somebody says the word mat. I don't consider a mat to be like something that would be laborious to carry. But I'm not gonna argue with, whatever, if that's what it says. But just thinking about it, if there's 39 categories of work prohibited on the Sabbath, there aren't 39 categories in the Bible. So this oral tradition has 39 categories. It says the specific prohibition against carrying items like a mat would depend on context, such as whether one is in a private or public domain, and whether the mat is considered a burden that one should not carry on the Sabbath. So he must have been in a public space because Jesus found him and he was outside by this pool where there were other people there. So that's a public space, if that's what's considered public. And people saw him carrying it, so he must have been in a public space. And then he mentioned, the guy in the Bible mentioned, the one who got healed mentions, the man who healed me told me. And then they're like, they're kind of concerned about him healing too. They're like, he shouldn't be healing people either. You shouldn't be healing on the Sabbath. It's not even like, oh, it's fake that he was healing, or oh, that wasn't really a miracle. It was fake, he's faking it. There wasn't that conversation. They weren't even amazed that this guy got healed. The ultra religious people were concerned that he was healing. Now, I don't know, I always interpreted this to be out of jealousy. It's like that he's healing and they maybe can't do those miracles, or that he's healing and, telling people to do things that isn't according to the tradition, and he's like having some authority over the people, and the authority of these leaders is kind of, they're feeling like their authority is more diminished. People aren't listening to them anymore or obeying the laws and the instructions that they provide about how to obey the laws. They're not obeying the laws anymore because they're busy, getting healed and, I wonder about that, because there just seems to be so many layers to this, this story. And it says this has been further explored and codified in the Talmud and later legal texts by Jewish legal authorities. So I asked, how old is the Mishnah? The Mishnah was compiled around 200 CE, so 200 years after Jesus, by Rabbi Judah the Prince, Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. It represents an early codification of Jewish oral law. So, early codification of Jewish oral law. So Jewish oral law was already there, but this is it. The Mishnah is the written down version of that, and is considered one of the foundational texts of rabbinical Judaism. Its teachings continue to influence Jewish law and tradition to this day. But, I asked, would Jesus have had access to Mishnah knowledge such as tractate Shabbat? It says no, Jesus would not have had access to the Mishnah as we know it today, because it was compiled around 200 CE. CE is pretty much Common Era, or people who like to use 80. So while Jesus lived during the 1st century CE, the way the centuries are kind of determined are, by Jesus. That is kind of, the presence of Jesus was so strong that, he was considered to have been, it was considered the year of our Lord, and that was considered the 1st century. So timeline-wise, things count that way. The Jewish calendar does not count that way. I think it's in year 5,785 or something around that. Because I remember when it reached 5,770, I was still going to a Messianic Jewish church around that time. And so, and I remember the 770. If you go on 770 Live, that's a Chabad. Their address is 770. Their website is 770. There's a significance to that number, and so once it hit that year, I remember people saying there might be a significance to it. People were pretty pumped up and excited about it being some kind of year like that. It says, however, during Jesus' time, there were oral traditions and teachings regarding Jewish law and practice that would have been circulating. These teachings would have been similar to the concepts later codified in the Mishnah, including those related to the Sabbath, but they were not yet formally compiled or written down. So there wasn't a book called the Mishnah that people were able to access, or a scroll that was called the Mishnah that people were able to access, but people had this oral tradition. Now, from what I understand, from Jewish tradition, it's taught that Moses on Sinai was given the Ten Commandments, he was given the Torah, and he was also given the Torah, which is the first 5 books of the Bible if you're a Christian, and he was given the oral Torah. And from the time of Moses, the oral Torah was passed down, as well as the Torah. And the 10 Commandments are in the Torah. The oral Torah is basically, if you've ever read a Mishnah, it's like I said, you can take a commandment like the 4th commandment of keeping the Sabbath, and I think the Sabbath commandment is probably the longest commandment of the 10 commandments, with all the details of what to not do and stuff. And even as long as it is, there's still tractate Shabbat in the Mishnah that has more about what you can't do, and there's 39 other things in addition to the, I think it's including the ones in Exodus chapter 20. There's 39 other things that aren't mentioned in the written Torah, and so I would like to see what those are. So I asked, which law were the Pharisees in the New Testament quoting when they mentioned to Jesus that it is not lawful for Jesus to heal, or for the man who was healed to pick up his mat and walk? And so it says specifically the laws of rest on the Sabbath are found in Exodus 20, like I said before, and Deuteronomy 5, 12 through 15. So it keeps going back to this oral tradition. It's in the Mishnah, later on in the Talmud, and it says in John 5:10, for example, when Jesus healed a man and told him to pick up his mat and walk, the Pharisees objected, citing their interpretations of the Sabbath laws as justification for their criticism. Now, I have one more question, but I didn't write it and I forgot. Okay, so it says there are 39 categories of prohibited work. What are the 39 categories of prohibited work in the Mishnah? Alright, so it's got a lot. Okay. So 39. Okay, so carrying is number 36. I don't know if there's a significance to this order, to the order that they're in. Carrying is 1. Does it say healing? Caring is one. I don't see it in here. Healing. So let me read through these. The 39 categories of prohibited work, or melachot, on the Sabbath, as outlined in the Mishnah, are sowing, like sowing seeds, plowing, reaping. I remember there was where was it where Jesus' disciples were plucking grain? So I think it's within one of these. They're sowing, plowing, reaping, binding sheaves, threshing, winnowing, selecting, grinding. So a lot of that is manual labor. A lot of it has to do with rural kind of manual labor. You know, if you're in the city, unless you have like a garden or something, you're probably not sowing or plowing or reaping or binding sheaves or threshing, or I don't even know what winnowing is. Selecting, grinding, sifting, kneading, baking. So that comes into cooking. So that's probably why people can't cook. Shearing wool, washing wool, combing wool, dyeing, like dyeing as in like colors of dyes, spinning, weaving, making two threads, tying, untying, sewing as in sewing up clothing, tearing, trapping, slaughtering, skinning, salting meat. That's interesting. Do they just mean like basically with a salt shaker salting meat, or like salting it to as part of like a drying or a what's it called when you kind of like soak the meat overnight or something? I don't remember the word. Okay, salting meat, preparing hides, writing, erasing, building, demolishing, extinguishing a fire, finishing an object, transporting between domains, carrying, fixing a vessel, smoothing, cutting to shape. So that really cuts into like hobbies and stuff too. Like, I don't know if something like working out would count, and I don't know if would this be considered fixing a vessel? Where would healing be on this? Because I don't see healing. I don't see healing unless there's one of these terms that I don't really understand that is considered healing. I don't really see it. So I'm wondering what would be healing. But yeah, I just found it interesting. That story in John was really interesting. I mean, it goes on from that point. Jesus goes, I think when does the feeding of the 5,000 happen? I don't know, but it becomes a very interesting story. Like, I like these stories. I like reading them and looking at them and kind of thinking about the scenarios that are going on and trying to figure out what it is that's going on. Because reading it through a lens of being raised Christian is different, I think, from people who are Jewish that might read it. I don't really think Jewish people are super interested in reading the New Testament, but the ones who do read it, when they read it, they're like, oh yeah, it's breaking the commandments. Because they're looking at it from, oh well, these Pharisees are saying, the Orthodox leadership is saying, you're not doing this right. And but the part that I like, that I'm not going to go into because I'm going to stop recording soon. The part that I like is always Jesus' response. That's where I find myself getting lost, is because I can understand all the historical background and all this kind of, okay, there's like an oral Torah and they're quoting this thing, this, or maybe even if it's not written, they kind of know this oral tradition and they're talking about it. And even though now we have, a Mishnah that's written and the Talmud that's written, like all of these books, there's so many books that are written now in you know in you know other Jews would have known about this. I mean, it's an oral tradition. So I guess, how was how was Mishnah oral tradition passed down before it was codified? I don't know if it's right. So before the Mishnah was codified, oral tradition was passed down through a combination of methods: teacher-student relationship, public discourse, repetition and memorization, mnemonic devices, practice and example, gradual compilation. I think that's possible because, like I said, when I was going to like a religious school, we learned all these verses and songs and stuff, and even when you see someone do for their bar mitzvah portion, when they're like chanting from the Torah, they use trope or cantillation marks. It kind of has a melody to things, and with this melody, it does make it a little bit easier to remember. And you can kind of use these melodies for memorization. Now I don't know specifically if that was the method if they were using those methods or what it was, but teacher-student relationship, rabbinic teachings were often transmitted in direct teacher-student relationship, where students learned from their teachers through discussion, debate, and memorization. Public discourse, rabbis would teach in public gatherings, sharing interpretations of the Torah and oral laws. This allowed for communal learning and reinforcement of traditions. And you see this throughout a lot of the New Testament. You see Jesus, he has students, he has disciples, they're following him around all the time and trying to learn from him, and there's a lot of discussion, and people are trying to do what he says. You see the public discourse. This is like most of what you see with Jesus, with the Pharisees, is public discourse and talking about the Torah and these oral laws and these traditions and talking about them with public discourse. There's repetition and memorization. Oral tradition relied heavily on memorization. Students would memorize texts and teachings, often through repetition, which helped ensure the accurate transmission of knowledge. There is such thing as oral histories. In the modern day, westernized view, it seems weird to try to think about, but there are a lot of indigenous groups with oral traditions and oral cultures that pass down knowledge. Now, as far as tribal traditions, I would say Judaism and their tribal traditions with the religion is a little more mainstream than maybe like an indigenous American group or someone from like a South American country, the indigenous groups of people and like how they might have or do pass down oral knowledge. You see that with medicinal kind of remedies and healing techniques and shamanism and stuff like that. Like, yeah, you can find books about stuff, but when you think about even back then, people were surprised. They were like, how does Jesus know, when he wasn't, how did he learn all this? There was always that question where people were like, how does he know all of this? Like, based on where he's from, it wouldn't have been common for him to know. Either from the background of his family, they weren't rabbis. How does he have such knowledge? And when you notice, like, the Pharisees aren't necessarily challenging him so much on things. I mean, they're challenging him on everything, but I feel like they were challenging everyone on everything all the time. Like, you think of it, this guy picks up his mat, he goes to walk after he's been healed. They see him carrying this mat in a public space, and they're like, you're breaking the commandment. And he's like, this other person who healed me told me to do it. And they're like, well, he's breaking the commandment too, because he can't tell you to carry this, and he can't be healing people. But I don't see where it says about healing. I don't know where the interpretation about healing on the Sabbath is. I thought it would be more obvious, so I don't know which category that falls into. The only thing I could see is like repairing a vessel, but I don't really know. Mnemonic devices, techniques such as acronyms or rhythmic phrasing were used to aid memory and make complex legal concepts easier to remember. Practice and example, rabbis would model behaviors and practices showing how laws were to be observed, which reinforce learning through real-life application. So that's why you usually see, these people kind of showing themselves in public, and practicing. I did that already. Gradual compilation. Over time, certain traditions and teachings became more standardized, leading to the eventual compilation of the Mishnah by Rabbi Judah the Prince around 200 CE. This was a response to the need to preserve these teachings in a rapidly changing social and political environment. So certain of these traditions became more standardized. These methods helped maintain continuity and ensure that the core teachings and laws were preserved before being formally codified. So people were already doing it. People were already following these oral traditions, just they weren't written down yet. And Jesus was challenging some of these oral traditions with some of the stuff he was doing, some of the stuff his disciples were seen doing. And I guess the argument is, are the oral, or I guess, trying to fact check myself. Where did oral traditions of Jewish commandments originate? The oral traditions of Jewish commandments, known as the oral law, oral Torah, are believed to have originated alongside the written Torah, the 5 books of Moses. According to Jewish tradition, God gave Moses both the written and oral instructions on Mount Sinai. Okay, so I just wanted to make sure I wasn't saying the wrong thing based on what I've learned. There's 4 different things. It says Sinai tradition, early transmission, rabbinic development, and crisis and codification. The oral law is Sinai tradition, the oral law is seen as a necessary complement to the written text, providing interpretation, elaboration, and application of the commandment. So I'm not sure, but I would assume that Aaron's lineage would have been the ones responsible, because they were the priestly ones, and they would have probably been the ones responsible for passing down these traditions. Am I accurate in saying that? I don't know. But it seemed like there was a difference between Moses the Levites and the rest of the congregation of the Jewish people that were not the priestly people and were not Moses. Early transmission. After the Sinai experience, these teachings were transmitted orally from generation to generation. The early prophets, judges, and eventually the rabbis played significant roles in preserving and teaching these traditions. Rabbinic development over time. As Jewish life evolved, the rabbis began to synthesize and develop these oral teachings, addressing new situations and questions that arose within the community. And crisis in codification. By the time of the Second Temple's destruction in 70 CE, there was increasing concern about the preservation of these oral teachings due to the diaspora and cultural shifts. This led to efforts to codify the oral law, culminating in the compilation of the Mishnah around 200 CE. So the Second Temple's destruction was in 70 CE. So I really don't like using ChatGPT for stuff, but I like it at this very moment. It's helpful. But I'd say still go back and look everything up. The destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE was primarily caused by a combination of political, social, and religious factors. So when you think of it, the reason why I'm interested in 70 CE is because I guess the first, was it Galatians? That's the first book of the New Testament that was written, or is it the first of Paul's writings? Somewhere between like 40 and 60 AD was the first New Testament book. And I think it took maybe over I don't know how long of a period, but if you think about like that 200-year period, there was Jesus, there was the death of Jesus, there was the development of religion called Christianity or something like that, the origins of Christianity, or the sect that sprouted out of, Judaism through Jesus. I'm still confused about John the Baptist's role, because he was there before Jesus, and he was already baptizing people. So I never really understood that whole baptism of John, because there was really no Jesus. Like, so what was John baptizing people for? And is it the same thing as a ritual mikvah, for the ritual cleansing? I don't really know, but basically the Second Temple destruction, because there had been Roman occupation all that time. So you have Jesus, you have you have John the Baptist, you have Jesus, you have all these different disciples of John the Baptist, disciples of Jesus. It seems like Jesus is on some continued mission similar to John's. John was saying that Jesus was way more worthy than he was, but John also baptized Jesus. I don't really know. So basically, timeline-wise, these first century people, don't have a written text outside of the, I don't know if they only had the Torah at that point and the Old Testament writings. I don't know if there were other books or scrolls that people were, well, I guess there was the apocryphal stuff too. A lot of it would have been still like older. So around where the second temple is destroyed, there's New Testament books being written. There's this Christian religion. There's conflict between Jewish people, Christian people. I don't remember when it was that Jews and Christians stopped worshiping in the same synagogues, but there is a point in history in which the religions officially split, where Christianity is, people who are Christians are being like kicked out of the synagogues or not allowed to, there's too much conflict there, because it's too different. It gets to a point where it's like, well, these people aren't even following the same thing anymore. And then the stuff about the divinity of Jesus and all that starts happening around the Council of Nicaea. However many councils there were, like, I don't know how many councils over how many years. I recorded about that before. But basically, you have the Roman occupation. It says since 63 BC. So the Roman occupation before the destruction of the temple had been going on already for like, this is a little under, 140 years. Religious tensions. There were deep divisions within Jewish community regarding how to respond to Roman rule. Some advocated for cooperation, while others, particularly the Zealots, called for armed resistance. The Jewish revolt in 66 CE, the First Jewish-Roman War, broke out as a response to Roman oppression. This rebellion escalated tensions that led to violent confrontations between Jewish factions and Roman forces. Siege of Jerusalem in 70 CE. The Roman general Titus laid siege to Jerusalem. The city faced severe famine and internal strife as different Jewish groups fought among themselves. Destruction of the temple. After several months, Roman forces breached the city's defenses. The temple was set on fire, and despite initial orders to preserve it, it was ultimately destroyed as part of the Roman strategy to squash the rebellion and demonstrate their power. And so that's something for another day, but I was just curious because I'm thinking, in my mind, I'm thinking, a lot is happening during this time period. The 60, for like 100 something years, almost like 140 years, there's a lot going on. And then after that time period, you start seeing, or during and after, you kind of start seeing more of this New Testament documents, and the Mishnah is written, the Talmud is written. There's a lot going on in the first couple hundred years. If you compare, and the temple's destroyed. So there's a lot going on. So it sounds to me like the timing where Jesus comes into play, and John the Baptist, I guess. Roman rule has already been going on for like 60 something years. And then it goes on for another like 70 something years after that. So that's complex. That's really complex. And I wonder how some of the early development of Christianity is kind of determined, because thinking about the timeline, if the Jewish temple gets destroyed in 70 CE, whenever the Council of Nicaea happens, and now there's kind of like this new religion, it's Rome that eventually kind of comes in and starts being the leadership in Christianity. Rome kind of takes that. Christianity kind of falls out of Jewish hands at a certain point, and it's no longer Jewish people, it's Roman people. There becomes that, who's Antiochus Epiphanes or whatever. However, we got to the place where, there's Sunday churches, and, the Catholic Church eventually comes out. The Catholic Church forms. So it says the Catholic Church traces its origins to the teachings of Jesus Christ. But if you look at it, Catholicism looks nothing like what Judaism looked like, or early Christianity looked like when Jesus was on earth. Catholicism doesn't look like that. It's not the same thing. I don't think it's the same thing. And that's kind of my general position. A lot of times when I'm recording, I don't really see it. It's not the same thing. At least as it is in modern day, I don't see it as similar. Like, so many of the teachings are so different. Like, there's, like, if you think about even the story with Sukkot and the debates that are happening with Jesus and these religious leaders, and the healing and the mat and the learning and the teaching and all that kind of stuff, and then you fast forward to Catholicism, they're no longer talking about the commandments and the laws. It's more of like worshiping Jesus. It's just confusing. History is a little bit confusing with religious stuff. Okay, in timelines we have that Pentecost is considered the birth of the church, which is somewhere around 30 to 33 CE, which isn't that long after the death of Jesus, I would say. The Council of Nicaea is 325 CE. So you don't even have, I don't think, these strong ideas about when is, which books are canonized. By that point, you have the New Testament books, letters, mostly epistles. At that time, you have the Mishnah and the Talmud by that point. And a lot of the controversy around the divinity of Jesus, the virgin birth of Jesus, the virginity of Mary, the Messiah concepts. Does Jesus meet criteria to be the Messiah? And a lot of different concepts that you don't really see while Jesus is walking around on earth too much. You don't see that too much. I feel like after whatever happened with Mary giving birth to Jesus, it seems like they survived that and kind of everybody moves on. And so Um, and it says recognition of the church. The term Catholic, meaning universal, was first used in the early 2nd century by Saint Ignatius of Antioch to describe the church. So the 2nd century. So near when the Mishnah was developed or written, 200 years later. So you have all this stuff going on before the actual Catholic Church, and then with the Council of Nicaea, you see more forms of different themes to what is now modern day Christianity. But this is 325 years later for the Council of Nicaea, like 200 or something years later for the term of Catholic Church. You know, the destruction of the temple in 70 CE. Like, you've got decades, multiple decades between Jesus walking on earth and all this other stuff going on. But it was a busy, I think a busy 300 something years. But you know, it's very intriguing. It's very intriguing. And you know, Sukkot as an 8-day holiday, I think 2 days you don't work. The last day you don't work as well, on the 8th day. You're, you know, commanded to live in a booth or a hut of some form, in commemoration to, you know, the Israelites living in huts in the wilderness when they left from Egypt. And Jesus was in the area, I guess Jerusalem, where this was being celebrated. And he's teaching in the temple at that time. And you can go into the book of John and see what it was that he was teaching. But I don't know. This is just kind of what's been on my mind. I just kind of wanted to look at it on ChatGPT, and I figured I'll record while I look at it because I don't want to go back and have to try to remember what I read. So I don't know what you guys think about me using ChatGPT for stuff. I think it's good for referencing. I don't fully trust it. But I'm using it at the moment. But I prefer to read first and then kind of come up with the questions after, and then let ChatGPT give me a little bit. I like the historical, like the dates, the timestamps of things. I kind of need that. And then, but as far as biblical, I would recommend people to more like read the Bible themselves, and then from the Bible, trying to kind of figure out where to go from there. Again, the most interesting thing to me is usually not Jesus healing or Jesus doing miracles and the people that get healed and their responses. Usually I'm more interested in how do the religious leaders react? What are they saying about what Jesus did? And then what does he respond to what they say? To me, that's usually more of an interest when I'm actually studying stuff on my own. Because I like the dialogue, and I like to think about like the history of everything. Because I do think Christianity is very much, you know, taught to focus more on Paul's writings. But it's kind of weird, because when you read a lot of the stuff that Paul writes, you're like, did Jesus say that? You know, I don't think Jesus ever said don't keep the commandments. I mean, he talked a lot about the commandments. And even though he wasn't necessarily keeping them according to this oral tradition, I don't think of the commandments in the Torah. I don't think there were ones that he was breaking that I remember. But he probably would have had knowledge of the oral Torah, and awareness of the traditions, and knowing that, you know, he could be in trouble for not following those traditions or teaching others not to follow those traditions. And I could see how that would cause a lot of conflict. Now, Paul, coming from what he says, he was a Pharisee and comes from the Pharisees, and you know, when you get into Paul's writings, he eventually is teaching people not to keep the commandments. And, you know, there's this conversation about the sacrifice of Jesus as a sacrifice, and all these different topics that it's just, I can't get into all of it right now. I'm already like 46 minutes over what I thought I was going to record, so let me just stop. I need to go eat breakfast. Hopefully this was interesting. I'm not saying that I have the authority. I'm just giving I'm studying through things and talking about what I've studied through and kind of my perspective on it and kind of the direction I like to take with it and kind of the stuff that I'm still kind of looking into on it. I'm not saying that I'm even going in the right direction, or that I'm right and everybody else is wrong, or that the Catholic Church is wrong, or that the Jewish, the ultra-Orthodox are wrong, or that the Pharisees were wrong, or that Jesus was wrong. I don't know. I'm just saying, I read this thing in this book in the Bible because it was near the holidays, and this is kind of what comes out of it. As for my own traditions, I would like to do some recording about Halloween. I just don't know what to record yet. People seem to like the scary, not so scary story that I put out last year. I don't have a story like that right now. I'm gonna try to think of one maybe. I've talked about them all though, but I've had some really interesting experiences that I think maybe I might talk about. I'll think about it. All right, guys. Thanks for listening.